300 feet beneath the Baltic Sea, a rock was singing. Not the chaotic noise you'd expect from granite, but a perfect, impossible note. Dr. Alistair Finch had come to debunk another myth with science and data. Instead, he discovered something that would shatter everything he believed about the natural world. But when military contractors arrived to weaponize his find, the man who built his career destroying mysteries became the guardian of the greatest secret on Earth. Dr. Alistair Finch moved like a shark in a well-defined tank. The stage of the university lecture hall was his ocean, the tiered rows of students his ecosystem. He was all sharp angles and restless energy, dressed in a tailored grey suit that seemed immune to wrinkles. Behind him, a massive screen displayed a grainy, vaguely circular image taken from the murky depths of the Baltic Sea. Superimposed over it in bold, crimson letters were the words that formed the core of his professional faith. Pareidolia, glacial deposit, myth. The human brain, he began, his voice cutting through the hall's expectant silence, is a pattern recognition machine. It is our greatest evolutionary gift and our most profound intellectual weakness. We see faces in clouds, animals in burnt toast, and conspiracies in coincidence. We call this tendency pareidolia, and it is the single most profitable engine for the cottage industry of nonsense that plagues our modern world. He paced, a remote clicker in his hand like a weapon. Which brings us to this. He gestured to the screen without looking. The Baltic Sea Anomaly, a grainy sonar image from 2011 that has spawned a decade of breathless speculation. Is it a crashed UFO? An ancient temple? The Millennial Falcon's less famous cousin? A ripple of polite laughter went through the students. Finch offered a thin, fleeting smile. The answer, as is almost always the case, is infinitely more mundane and, to a scientific mind, far more elegant. What you are looking at is almost certainly a glacial erratic. A large, unusually shaped stone transported by a moving ice sheet during the Pleistocene and deposited on the seafloor when the ice retreated. It is a rock, nothing more. The evidence to the contrary, the supposed right angles, the mysterious runways, are artifacts of low-resolution sonar scans and the fervent imaginations of those who would rather believe in magic than in geology. He leaned forward on the lectern, his tone shifting from dismissive lecturer to passionate sermonizer. A claim without evidence can be dismissed without evidence, but a scientific claim must be falsifiable. It must be testable. It must be open to the possibility of being proven wrong. The believers of these myths offer nothing of the sort. They offer only mystery, faith, and a profound disrespect for the rigorous, beautiful, and difficult work of finding out what is actually true. He stood up straight, his sermon complete. And in a few weeks, I and a small team will be taking the research vessel Logos to the Baltic to do just that. We will conduct the first high-resolution, multi-spectrum analysis of this object, and we will put another ghost to rest with the harsh, clarifying light of data. Weeks later, that clarifying light was pouring from a wall of monitors in the control room of the Logos. The space was the polar opposite of the warm, wood-paneled lecture hall. It was a cold, dark, humming chamber of pure function, adrift on the calm surface of the Baltic Sea. Finch, now in practical dark blue expedition gear, looked more at home here than anywhere else. He pointed a finger at a central screen where a three-dimensional sonar image was slowly rendering. There, Ava. Look at the density returns, he said, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. His assistant, Eva Rostova, a brilliant and eager geophysicist barely out of her doctorate program, leaned in. Her expression was one of intense focus, her admiration for Finch palpable. It's non-porous, she said, tracing the object's outline on the screen with her finger. The density is uniform, exactly as you predicted. Exactly, Finch affirmed. Granite, or a close cousin, dragged 1,000 kilometers from the mountains of Scandinavia and dropped right here. It's textbook. On the screens, data flowed from the submersible ROV working silently in the crushing dark 300 feet below them. Video feeds showed a lumpy, enormous shape, its surface covered in silt and marine life. It was undeniably large and vaguely circular, but it was also clearly, disappointingly, a rock. There were no runways, no perfect right angles, no signs of alien engineering, just geology, raw and uninteresting. Finch dictated notes into a recorder, his voice crisp and professional, but underneath it was the unmistakable tone of a man being proven right. He was closing the loop, fulfilling the promise he made in his lecture hall. Every new scan, every telemetry reading, was another nail in the coffin of another silly myth. Night fell. The gentle hum and rock of the vessel became a soothing lullaby. The control room, once a hub of quiet activity, was now empty, save for Finch. He sat alone amidst the glowing screens, a cup of rapidly cooling coffee at his elbow, compiling the final report. All the data was in, conclusive and utterly mundane. The expedition was a success. He had done what he had set out to do, just one final box to check, a procedural formality. He initiated the acoustic resonance scan, a test to measure the vibrational frequency of the material below. For a granite formation of this size, he expected the result to be a chaotic mess of dissonant frequencies, the acoustic equivalent of static. He barely watched as the test ran, his mind already on the wording of the press release that would announce their findings. The test completed. A soft, clear chime echoed in the silent room. Finch glanced at the screen, and his train of thought derailed. The display was wrong. It wasn't showing a chaotic hash of noise. It was showing a single, pure, unwavering line. A sine wave so perfect, it looked like a diagram from a physics textbook. It was a single, sustained, resonant frequency, clean as a tuning fork's chime. He frowned. An error. It had to be. He was about to reboot the system when a small, insistent flag appeared in the corner of the display. It was a diagnostic warning from the analysis software itself, a program he had helped design. In small, sterile text, it read, "Impossible resonance. Data anomaly?" Finch leaned closer, the ambient glow of the monitors casting long shadows across his face. The soft hum of the ship's electronics suddenly seemed louder, questioning. The perfect line on the screen didn't waver. It was a single, impossible note, held indefinitely by a simple, boring rock in the dark water below. And for the first time in a decade, the unflappable Dr. Alistair Finch felt the cold, unfamiliar touch of uncertainty. Error, anomaly, glitch. The words cycled through Dr. Alistair Finch's mind, a frantic attempt to build a rational wall against the impossible fact glowing on his monitor. He was a man who trusted his instruments, but he trusted the laws of physics more. And the laws of physics stated that a lump of granite, 300 feet down, could not and should not be singing a perfect A sharp. He began to move, the slow paralysis of disbelief breaking into a flurry of methodical action. This was no longer about discovery, it was about diagnostics. He powered down the entire acoustic array, his fingers flying across the touch panels. He checked power couplings, re-ran the calibration software, and cross-referenced the hydrophone sensitivity against the ship's own engine vibrations. He was trying to disprove the data, to find the flaw in the machine that would allow the world to make sense again. For 2 hours he worked, a high priest performing the sacred rites of the scientific method, confident that repetition and rigor would expose the heresy. Finally, he was ready. He initiated the scan again. The progress bar crept across the screen, each percentage point a tick of a clock counting down to his vindication or his bewilderment. The result appeared identical, the same pure, unwavering line, a perfect signal in a sea of noise. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. He ran it a third time, this time routing the raw data through a different set of processors. bypassing the main analysis suite entirely. It made no difference. The signal was real. The machine was not lying. His arrogance, that comfortable cloak he had worn for so many years, began to feel thin and frayed. It wasn't a flaw in the equipment. It was a flaw in his understanding. He frantically pulled up the other data sets, the mineralogy scans, the density readings, the magnetic survey. He stared at the numbers, his mind racing. A rock with this composition, this mass, should have the acoustic properties of a brick. Instead, it was behaving like a colossal, perfectly engineered tuning fork. The numbers didn't just disagree. They screamed at each other from across an impossible chasm. The man who had arrived in the Baltic to put a myth to bed had instead found a monster in the dark. A quiet, elegant, terrifyingly real monster. The sun rose, its weak northern light filtering into the control room to find Finch not triumphant, but haunted. He hadn't slept. He found Ava in the mess hall and with a quiet intensity that unnerved her, simply said, "We need a sample, now." For the next 18 hours, the Logos was a hive of obsessive work. They guided the ROV on a delicate, nerve-wracking mission, its manipulator arm scraping a tiny fragment from the anomaly's surface. They watched on the monitors as the tiny piece no bigger than a thumbnail was secured in a sample container and began its slow ascent from the crushing dark. In the ship's pristine lab, under the sterile glare of halogen lights, Finch placed the fragment under an electron microscope. He peered into the eyepiece, adjusted the focus, and forgot to breathe. He waved Eva over, his hand trembling slightly. "Look," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. Eva looked. On the microscope's display was a sight that no geologist had ever seen. It was not the chaotic, jumbled structure of rock. It was a lattice, a perfect, repeating geometric pattern of interlocking crystals. It was organized with a precision that seemed less like geology and more like architecture. "It's not a rock," Finch said, a manic grin spreading across his face. The fear and confusion of the previous night had been burned away by the incandescent thrill of discovery. "It's a naturally formed crystal. The atomic structure it has a perfect harmonic resonator. That's why it sings. The entire object is a single, continuous crystal." He looked at Ava, his eyes wild with excitement. "This isn't just a new mineral, Eva. This is a new form of matter. It's the discovery of a lifetime." His worldview wasn't breaking. It was expanding into something larger and more wonderful than he had ever dared to imagine. His triumphant thought was shattered by a sound that did not belong in the quiet world of his ship, the percussive, deafening roar of a helicopter. They rushed to the deck. Descending from the grey sky was a sleek, matte black helicopter, devoid of any markings or logos. It landed on the ship's helipad with military precision. The hatch slid open, and 3 men disembarked. The man in the lead, Marcus Thorne, was in his 50s, dressed in a bespoke suit that probably cost more than a year of Finch's salary. He moved with the smooth, predatory grace of a man who didn't own rooms, but entire buildings. His 2 aides were built like the security features of those buildings, solid and impassive. "Dr. Finch," Thorne said, his voice calm and steady against the dying whine of the rotors. He extended a hand, his smile a thin, bloodless line. "Marcus Thorne, I'm the managing partner of the firm that handled your funding. We're so pleased with your progress." The words were a congratulations, but the tone was an audit. Later, in the ship's mess hall, the atmosphere had grown heavy and cold. Thorne sat across from Finch, a slim leather folder on the table between them. "Your preliminary reports are fascinating," Thorne began, his eyes holding Finch's. "Specifically the acoustic dampening properties you noted. This resonance, it doesn't just create a tone, does it, Doctor? It absorbs other frequencies. It creates a zone of silence." Finch, still buzzing from his discovery, nodded eagerly. "The potential applications for seismic research are staggering. We could create sonically quiet zones on the seafloor, filter out background noise to study deep earth tremors with unprecedented clarity." He trailed off as he saw the look in Thorne's eyes. The man wasn't listening. He was calculating. Thorne slid the folder across the table. It opened to reveal a document dozens of pages long, filled with dense legal text. An ironclad non-disclosure agreement. "We need to control the narrative on this, Alistair," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial quiet. "This discovery is too important to be released haphazardly. For proprietary reasons, all data, all samples, all findings are to be turned over to us for review before any publication." The request hung in the air, but it wasn't a request. The friendly funder had vanished, replaced by the owner. It was a command, and Finch suddenly felt the cold, terrifying realization that the most important discovery in human history was no longer his. The non-disclosure agreement lay on the table like a tombstone. It was a declaration that his discovery was no longer a matter of science, but of property. The thrill Alistair Finch had felt in the lab curdled into a cold, creeping dread. The joy of discovery was gone, replaced by the grim mathematics of power. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had none. That night, the control room felt less like a laboratory and more like a mausoleum. The single pure sine wave still glowed on the main screen, but it was no longer a song of creation. It was a siren S-call, luring them all toward a darker purpose. Finch sat alone, the rhythmic pulse of the ship's engines a slow, methodical heartbeat, counting down to a future he could no longer see. He pulled his wallet from his back pocket, and from a hidden slit in the leather, he slid out a solid-state drive no larger than his thumbnail. It was his emergency backup, his academic panic button, a device he'd never once had to use. With hands that were not quite steady, he plugged it into a diagnostic port, shielding the screen with his body. He wasn't a spy, he was a geologist. But his logical mind was processing the data from his encounter with Thorne, and the conclusion was inescapable. A threat was present, and a contingency was required. He began copying the core files, the digital soul of his discovery, the raw acoustic signature, the unredacted mineralogy reports, the spectrographic analysis. He encrypted the drive with a complex, multi-layered password he hadn't used in years, a relic from a more paranoid phase of his youth. Finally, he slipped the tiny drive from its port and with delicate precision, worked it into a nearly invisible seam in the strap of his waterproof watch. "What are you doing?" He flinched, turning to see Eva standing in the doorway, her face etched with concern. She had seen the tension, the secrecy. He looked from her worried face to the glowing screen, the beautiful, terrible line of the impossible resonance. "Ava," he said, his voice low and heavy. "People who fund science this generously don't do it for the good of humanity." His paranoia was validated sooner than he could have imagined. Back in his small cabin, the door opened without a knock. Thorne's two aides entered, their movements swift and economical. The polite fiction of their roles had dissolved. They were no longer assistants. They were operators. One moved directly to Finch's desk, unplugging his laptops and gathering his handwritten logbooks. The other stood by the door, his arms crossed, his presence a silent, immovable wall. "What is this?" Finch demanded, his voice rising. The aide packing his life's work didn't look up. "Per Section 11B of your funding agreement," he recited, his tone flat and rehearsed. "All materials and data related to discoveries with potential strategic applications become the immediate and exclusive property of the funding entity." He closed a laptop with a final, dismissive snap. "Your work now has strategic applications, Doctor." They were taking everything, not with force, but with the cold, unassailable power of a contract he had barely skimmed. His personal space, his intellectual property, his entire world was being dismantled by a paragraph of fine print. Stripped of his data, his anger overriding his fear, Finch stormed to the ship's bridge. He found Thorne standing alone, staring out the wide windows at the black, starless expanse of the Baltic Sea. "You can't do this," Finch said, his voice shaking with rage. Thorne turned slowly, his face unreadable in the dim glow of the navigation instruments. The facade of civility was gone. "Can't I? It's already done." He gestured out at the dark water. "You see a scientific curiosity, Doctor. A wonder. I see the future of naval warfare. Your natural wonder creates a bubble of perfect silence. It's the key to making a nuclear submarine sonically invisible to its enemies. It's not a discovery, Finch. It's a weapon, a paradigm shift in global power." The words hit Finch like a physical blow. His science, his beautiful, pure pursuit of knowledge, twisted into a tool for conflict. This was his deepest, most personal sacrilege. The irrationality he had dedicated his life to fighting was now wearing the mask of his own reason. "My work is to be published," Finch said, his voice a weak defense. Thorne almost laughed. "Your work is to be classified. This entire area is now a restricted military zone. A helicopter will be here at 0400 to take you back to the mainland. Your involvement in this project is, as of now, concluded." He turned back to the window, dismissing Finch as casually as he might dismiss a junior analyst. "You were a stepping stone, Doctor, and you performed your function beautifully." The walk to the deck was a funeral march. The cold, wet wind whipped across the ship, tasting of salt and diesel. Thorne's men walked on either side of him, their presence a cage of muscle and cloth. The rhythmic whump, whump, whump of the waiting helicopter's rotors beat against his ears, a sound of finality. Then he saw her. Across the deck, another guard was leading Eva, not toward the helicopter, but down a narrow stairwell that led below deck. She wasn't being sent home. She was being retained, a liability to be managed. Her eyes met Finch's for a fraction of a second, and in them he saw pure terror. In that instant, everything shifted. It was no longer about his discovery, his reputation, or the corruption of science. It was about the terrified face of his assistant. He understood with absolute clarity that there was no reasoning with a man like Thorne. There was no appeal to a higher authority. There was only the predator and the prey. Reason and negotiation, the primary tools of his entire life, were useless. All that was left was a desperate, physical, and highly irrational act. He feigned a stumble, his body lurching sideways. He threw his weight against the guard to his right, sending the man sprawling into the one on his left. The moment of chaos was all he needed. He sprinted a desperate, clumsy dash across the few feet of open, grated decking. He didn't think, he just ran. He reached the railing and, without a second's hesitation, threw himself over the side. For one surreal moment, he was suspended between the roaring chaos of the helicopter and the silent abyss below. Then he hit the churning, black, freezing water of the Baltic Sea and was swallowed by the dark. The impact was a full-body explosion of cold. The Baltic Sea in the dead of night didn't just steal Alistair Finch's breath. It stole all thought, replacing it with a singular, blinding reality of freezing, crushing blackness. He was a creature of intellect, a man who lived in the clean, orderly world of data and theory, but in that moment, he was just an animal, flailing in a hostile element, his body screaming at the thermal shock. He surfaced, gasping, the wash from the helicopter's rotors churning the water around him into a chaotic froth. The Logos was a blaze of light, a receding island of warmth and safety. He was alone. His first instinct was panic, a raw, primal terror that threatened to drown him. But then, something else kicked in. The scientist. The part of his brain that never slept began to calculate. Water temperature, approximately 4 degrees Celsius. Body fat percentage, nominal. Time before incapacitation due to hypothermia, less than 30 minutes. He saw the faint, distant lights of the Swedish coastline, a barely visible smear against the horizon. His mind calculated the distance, the currents, the odds. They were terrible, but they were not zero. And so he swam. He swam with a desperate, mechanical rhythm, his mind a fortress against the encroaching cold that was seeping into his bones. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and grey, he was a ghost, a barely conscious automaton dragging himself from the surf onto a desolate, rocky beach. He collapsed onto the stones, his body shaking uncontrollably. The Logos was gone, a phantom that had vanished with the night. He was stripped of his name, his career, his life's work. He was nothing. Then, a flicker of memory. With a trembling hand, he touched his wrist. He felt the watch, and beneath the salt-stiffened strap, the tiny, hard rectangle of the drive. It was still there, a single microscopic fragment of who he used to be. It was enough. He forced himself to his feet and began the agonizing walk inland. Stockholm was a world away from the silent beach. It was a city of noise and people, none of whom saw the man of science, the celebrated geologist. They saw a hollow-eyed, shivering wreck of a man, his expensive suit ruined, his face etched with a desperate exhaustion. He found a pawnshop and sold his watch a timepiece that had marked a decade of lectures, expeditions, and triumphs for a handful of cash, carefully keeping the precious strap. The money bought him 1 hour of anonymity in a grimy internet cafe. He sat at a sticky terminal, his hands still shaking as he plugged the drive into the USB port. He held his breath as the file directory loaded. Then his heart sank. Folder after folder was flagged with the skull and crossbones icon of data corruption. The salt water had done its work. Frantically, he ran a recovery program, his hope dwindling with every failed sector scan. In the end, he had almost nothing. The drive had yielded only 3 fragments from the wreck of his discovery. The clean audio file of the anomaly's perfect, haunting resonance. A partial spectrograph, its edges dissolving into digital noise. And a single corrupted file on the mineral's crystalline structure that was unreadable. It wasn't proof. It was a curiosity. It was just enough to sound like a lunatic. On a small television mounted in the corner of the cafe, a news anchor spoke in Swedish, but the images were universal. Naval vessels, maps of the Baltic Sea, and the stern face of a Russian official. The caption read, "Submarine incident raises tensions." Finch knew it was a lie, a ghost story to cover the movements of Marcus Thorne. The clock was ticking. His old world was the University of Uppsala, a hallowed ground of reason and research. Now, it was a fortress, and he was the barbarian at the gates. He looked wild, unkempt, a man haunted. He tried to get past the receptionist at the geology department, insisting he had to see his old colleague, Dr. Lena Sorenson. He had no ID, no appointment, only a desperate story. "It's a new form of matter," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "They're going to turn it into a weapon, a kind of sonic camouflage." The receptionist smiled a tight, professional smile, but her eyes darted to the phone. She was quietly calling security. Finch saw the shift in her expression, the practiced dismissal she reserved for cranks and the unhinged. The humiliation was a physical sting. He, who had built a career on mocking unsubstantiated claims, was now the very definition of one. He turned and fled before the guards arrived, melting back into the anonymous city streets. Desperation led him to the shadows of Lena Sorenson's apartment building that night. When she arrived home, he stepped from the darkness, and she flinched, her keys ready in her hand like a weapon. "Alistair! My God, what happened to you?" she gasped. "Lena, please, you have to listen," he said, holding up the tablet he'd bought with the last of his cash. He showed her the fragmented data, the broken graphs. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the wildness of his story, and her expression hardened with skepticism. She was a scientist. She dealt in proof, not panicked ambushes in dark hallways. "Alistair, you look like you need help," she said softly, taking a step back. "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I know how this looks. Just one more thing." He navigated to the audio file. Put in your headphones. Please, as a scientist, as a geologist, just listen to this." Wary but intrigued by his insistence, she took out her earbuds and connected them to the tablet. She put them in, her face a mask of skepticism. Finch pressed play. He watched her face. For 5 seconds, there was nothing. Then, her eyes widened slightly, her brow furrowed. She tilted her head, as if trying to place the sound. It was the purest tone she had ever heard. A single, unwavering note that seemed to vibrate not just in her ears, but in her bones. As an acoustical geologist, she knew every sound the Earth made, from the groan of shifting plates to the hiss of deep-sea vents. This sound was not one of them. It was too perfect, too clean. It was impossible. She listened for a full minute, her scientific curiosity wrestling with her fear and skepticism. Finally, the curiosity won. She pulled the earbuds out, her expression completely transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a look of intense, dawning wonder, the same look he had worn in the lab what felt like a lifetime ago. "Where?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you get that sound?" He didn't have to answer. She unlocked the door to her building and held it open for him. "Get inside," she said. "Tell me everything." The University of Uppsala's Deep Earth Seismology Lab was a cathedral dedicated to listening to the planet's secrets. Racks of humming servers stood like monoliths in the chilled air, processing faint tremors from halfway across the globe. Here, amidst the quiet hum of immense computational power, Lena had smuggled Finch. They worked with a frantic, desperate energy, their faces illuminated by the glow of a dozen monitors. Their task was a statistical nightmare: to find a match, a single correlating echo for the anomaly's unique sonic signature from within petabytes of global seismic data. It was a search for one specific grain of sand on all the beaches of the world. "It has to be here," Lena murmured, her fingers flying across a keyboard, running another complex search query. A natural phenomenon of that magnitude must have left a trace somewhere. Finch paced behind her, his eyes fixed on a smaller monitor in the corner, displaying a live news feed. The headline read, "Swedish government protests unscheduled naval exercises in Baltic." The report showed grainy footage of a dark, military-style vessel, Finch's vessel, Thorne's vessel. He knew what exercises meant. They were beginning their experiments. They were going to bombard the anomaly, to test its limits, to find its breaking point. They were trying to break a miracle, and he and Lena were running out of time to prove it even existed. He was using the pinnacle of scientific instrumentation, not for the joy of discovery, but in a desperate defensive battle to save a truth he already knew. Aboard Thorne's military-grade vessel, the Argus, the deck was bathed in the cold, efficient glare of floodlights. A massive sonic emitter, a brutalist sculpture of steel and transducers, was winched over the side and lowered into the black water. On the bridge, Marcus Thorne watched the depth readings on a monitor. "Take it to 100 meters above the target," he commanded, his voice calm and devoid of emotion. "Begin the phased stress test. I want to know the exact frequency that shatters its resonant structure. Start at low power and increase in 5-minute intervals. I want to know its limits." A technician nodded. Initiating sequence. A low, guttural pulse, more a vibration felt in the teeth than a sound, emanated from the ship, plunging into the deep. It was the sound of a question being asked with a hammer, the ultimate corruption of the scientific method, an experiment whose only goal was to find the breaking point of a natural wonder in order to control it. Back in the lab, failure cascaded across the screens. No match. Query returned 0 results. Inconclusive correlation. The data was too vast. The signature was too clean, too unique. It didn't match any known volcanic, tectonic, or atmospheric phenomena. Finch slumped into a chair, the weight of his exhaustion a physical force. He was defeated. He stared at the spectrograph on the main screen, the elegant, perfect, lonely line of the anomaly's song. It was a signal from nowhere. And then, an idea sparked, not from the data, but from a memory, a lecture he had attended years ago, a wild, speculative theory about primordial harmonic structures forming in the Earth's mantle during the chaotic violence of the Hadean Eon. The theory suggested that certain mineral formations, under immense pressure and heat, could have become harmonically aligned with the planet's own resonant frequency, becoming planetary-scale tuning forks. He had publicly ridiculed the theory at the time, calling it untestable poetry, not science. Now, it was the only thing he had left. It was a leap of faith. "Lena, stop," he said, his voice quiet but urgent. "Forget modern data. It's not there." He stood and pointed to the screen. "That signature isn't a product of the world we know. It's an echo of a world that was." He took a deep breath. "Search the Deep Earth Echo archives, the pre-Cambrian data. Look for a matching signature from 4 billion years ago." Lena stared at him. "Alistair, that's insane. The data from that deep is almost pure noise." "It's not a long shot," he said, his eyes burning with a new strange fire. "It's the only shot." She saw the look on his face, not the wildness of a crank, but the focused intensity of a man seeing a new path. She nodded, her fingers flying once more, entering the insane parameters. The servers churned, sifting through the ghostly whispers of a planet being born. The screen was a waterfall of incomprehensible noise, and then a single line of text appeared. "Harmonic match found." They stared. There on the screen, faint and barely distinguishable from the background static, was a trace, a ghostly echo from the planet's core, recorded by a deep Earth probe years ago and forgotten. It was a perfect harmonic match to the anomaly's signature. It was the proof. The object wasn't alien. It was a relic, a piece of the Earth's original song, preserved for eons in the cold silence of the deep. They looked at each other, a shared look of stunned, breathless triumph. And in that exact moment, the world shattered. Red lights flashed, strobing across their faces. A deafening alarm shrieked through the lab. Thorne's people were in the building. With seconds to spare, Lena slammed her hand down on the keyboard, hitting the enter key. A program she had prepared launched, sending their findings, the proof, the audio file, and a scathing manifesto written by Finch to a preset list of every major news outlet, university, and geological society on the planet. Knowledge was now their only weapon. Weeks later, the sun was warm on Finch's face. He and Lena sat at an outdoor cafe in Stockholm, sipping coffee, the city's gentle hum a peaceful counterpoint to the memory of the lab's shrieking alarms. A television on the wall was playing a news report. An anchor was speaking in front of a graphic that read, "The Sorenson-Finch Thesis." The report detailed how an international scientific consortium had declared the Baltic Sea Anomaly a protected World Heritage Site, citing its unique nature as a primordial resonant structure. All military and commercial activity in the area was permanently halted. Marcus Thorne, the anchor noted, was under investigation by multiple maritime authorities. They had won. Finch looked at the screen, not with the fire of triumph, but with a quiet, weary relief. The victory wasn't in defeating Thorne, it was in revealing the truth. He had started this journey as an arrogant debunker, a man who believed science was a tool to confirm what was already known. He had been stripped of everything, forced to the brink, and had emerged as something new. A scientist who understood that true discovery required not just rigor, but humility. Not just data, but the courage to take a leap of faith into the beautiful, terrifying unknown. He was no longer just a man of science. He was a man of wonder. What a fascinating story about the nature of mystery itself. It starts with a conflict we all recognize: the clean, rational world of science versus the messy, imaginative world of superstition. And for a moment, science wins. Dr. Finch proves the anomaly is just a rock, and there's a certain satisfaction in that, in having a neat, tidy explanation. But the story's real genius is what it does next. It reveals that the scientific truth is actually far more poetic, more awe-inspiring than the original myth of a crashed UFO. The object wasn't alien, but it was a 4 billion-year-old piece of our planet, singing a perfect primordial note. It forces us to ask what we were really looking for when we chase these mysteries. Dr. Finch begins by thinking the enemy is irrational belief, but he discovers the true antagonist is something far worse: cynical ambition. The real villain isn't the person who sees a face in the clouds, but the person who sees a natural wonder and immediately asks, how can I use this as a weapon? The story suggests the true opposite of science isn't superstition, but a lack of wonder. It's the cold, calculated drive to control and exploit, rather than to simply understand and be humbled. So, after following Finch on his journey, I have to ask, what do you think is the greater human flaw, our tendency to believe in the fantastic, or our tendency to corrupt the magnificent?